This is the first in a series of programs about modern philosophy. Later in the series, we shall be dealing with the ideas of such world-famous figures as Jean-Paul Sartre, Marcuse, Karl Popper, Chomsky, and some of these will be taking part personally in the programs, discussing their own work. One or two programs will also be devoted to thinkers who are dead, but whose ideas still exert an enormous and living influence. Karl Marx is an obvious example, but so too in their quite different ways are Wittgenstein and Heidegger. And of course, a series produced in English for an English-speaking audience must pay particular attention to recent developments in philosophy in the English-speaking world. So my hope is that the series as a whole will add up to a lively and illuminating report on the state of philosophy in the world today, partly in terms of outstanding individuals and partly in terms of important movements. But in the opening program, by way of introduction, I want to confront some absolutely basic questions. Why should anyone be interested in philosophy anyway? Why is it important? Indeed, what is it exactly? I'm going to put these and other questions to someone who is himself of international reputation, Sir Isaiah Berlin, OM, Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, biographer of Karl Marx, and particularly distinguished for his knowledge of the history of ideas. So Isaiah, what reason can one give to someone for taking an interest in philosophy if he hasn't done so already on his own account, or if he hasn't been led to it by the education system?
Well, to begin with, these questions are interesting in themselves. But for anyone who doesn't think that, it's possible to point out that what philosophy deals with are the assumptions on which a great many normal beliefs rest. Not the sort of things which people like to dig up, because people sometimes don't really want their assumptions examined overmuch, because people are rather uncomfortable when they're made to look into what really their beliefs rest on. But in fact, the sort of assumptions which a great many ordinary common sense beliefs rest are matters for philosophical analysis. When looked at, they turn out to be a great deal less secure and a great deal more complicated than they seem at first. And philosophers, by examining these, teach people self-knowledge. They explain to them, sometimes in a very illuminating way, what they believe and why they believe it. And this is a very central task.
We're all of us made very uncomfortable by having our assumptions examined, as you just say, by digging into the presuppositions of our own thought. And I think we all, beyond a certain point, resisted. Why do you think we resisted?
Well, of course, because people don't like being overly analyzed, I suppose, and partly because action itself, perhaps, precludes this kind of thing. Quite obviously, if you're simply actively engaged in some kind of life, constantly to be asked, why do you do this? Are you sure that what the goals which you're pursuing are true goals? Are you certain that what you're doing is not, in some way, it doesn't contravene some kind of moral beliefs which perhaps you ought to hold? Or are you sure that some of your values don't conflict with certain other values and you're simply not facing that? That sometimes when you're plunged into some kind of dilemma, you are so frightened of looking it in the face that you avert your gaze and try and get the responsibility upon some other back, on the back of the state, for example, on the back of your teachers, on the back of your class, on the back of some other association to which you belong. Shouldn't you perhaps face this responsibility? This, I think, daunts people, naturally creates resistance. I will say this, that if everybody in a society were skeptical intellectuals constantly examining their own roots, nobody would be able to live at all. And therefore, men of action cannot be called upon, all of them, constantly to be examining themselves. And it's therefore the task of philosophers, who are, I suppose, people particularly curious about these things, to be doing this particular thing. But on the other side, it must be said that if these things are not examined and left fallow, then societies become ossified. Beliefs turn into dogma, imagination is warped, the intellect becomes sterile, societies decay as a result of simply lying on some comfortable bed of unexamined dogma. If imagination is to be stirred, if the intellect is to work, assumptions must be questioned. Presuppositions must be challenged. The whole thing has to be constantly looked at, and not by too many, and not too much perhaps, but nevertheless sufficiently to keep the society moving. Society moves by some degree of parricide, by which the children, on the whole, kill, if not their fathers, at least the beliefs of their fathers, and arrive at new beliefs. And this is how development occurs. This is what progress is.
Can you give me some examples of assumptions of this kind?
Well, let's say, for example, I think perhaps political or moral philosophy produced the most familiar one of these. Take, for example, talk about liberty or talk about equality, of which the world is at the present moment full. Take, for example, the famous phrase used in the preamble to the American Declaration of Independence, about which is a lot of talk because it happened about 200 years ago and it's suddenly come into prominence and quite a lot is being written about it at the present. There is a sentence about the fact that men were created, I think, I can't quote it exactly, men were created equal. And in order, and among the rights which have been conferred upon them.
We hold these truths to be self-evident,
that's right.
that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with, I think, certain unalienable rights, that among these are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Thank you very much. That's just what I wanted. Now then, rights. Now, what are rights? If you ask an ordinary man in the street what a right is, he'll be stumped. He won't quite be able to answer. Supposing you say, what kind of thing is a right? Is it something you have at birth? Is it something stamped upon you? Is it some intrinsic characteristic of a man? Is it something which someone has given you? Who? For example, can rights be conferred? Can they be taken away? Can you waive a right? What does that mean? Can you lose a right? Or is a right something which somehow is an intrinsic part of your nature in the way in which thinking is, or choosing, or having a will, or something of that sort? Is that what a right is? Are there natural rights? What kind of nature? What is nature in that sense? How do you know what these rights are? People have differed a very great deal about what these rights are. Take, for example, let me give you an example. Take, for example, the 17th century, when there's a great deal of talk about rights. Well, there's tremendous, after all, there's a civil war about this. Whether, for example, there is such a thing as divine right of kings. Well, we don't believe in that very much now, but a lot of people did believe in it. They believed that kings were special beings with special rights. Then there were other people who believed that no such thing existed. How did they argue? What kind of arguments did they produce? What convinced people? There's a French thinker towards the end of the 17th century who says, supposing the King of France wanted to transfer some subjects to the King of England, what would these subjects think about being transferred? And the answer is, they've no business to think. All they've got to do is to obey. They're subjects. And the king has a perfect right to do with them as he pleases. The very idea that they can think about it or doubt it is itself blasphemous and impious. Well, we reject it. But still, this is something which was passionately believed by a lot of people who believe in hierarchy. They believe that the world is a hierarchical whole, and all kinds of metaphors are used. It's a kind of pyramid with God at the top and the amoeba below. Every human being has its proper position in this hierarchy and ought to do those things which this position imposes upon him. Well, this is something which was believed for hundreds of years. Then there were people who denied this and said, there's no such thing, there isn't any such hierarchy. Men are equal. They are born as they are born. All men have certain natural desires, and all have men certain natural rights. And in respect to these rights, they are perfectly equal. Now, the kind of argument which can be produced either for one or for the other are a proper subject matter for philosophy. What else? What other subject can deal with these? And yet, these are things which are very profound. These are things about which men worry very deeply or have worried. These are subjects which bloody wars have been fought. These are subjects which touch the very heart.
Can you give a straightforward example of a moral philosophical question?
Well, let me tell you a story which somebody once told me during the last war. This was a British intelligence officer in France who, towards the end of the war, had to interrogate a French traitor whom it was resistance at court. He'd worked for the German secret police, for the Gestapo, and the resistance was determined to execute him as a traitor. And the British intelligence officer asked for permission to interrogate him because he thought he might give him useful information which might save people, innocent people, from torture and that sort of thing, and tell him something about what the Gestapo was still doing behind the lines. Well, he went to see this man. He was a young man, and the young man said to him, well, why should I answer your questions? If you can promise me my life, I'll answer. But if you can't promise me my life, I know these people intend to kill me tomorrow morning, why on earth should I talk at all? Well, now, what should that officer have done, the British officer? His duty as an officer was to extract as much information as he could. He could only do that by lying. It was no good saying, well, I'll do my best to persuade them or something. The man would have seen through that. He would say, yes, I can save your life. If you talk to me, I'll save your life. And in this way, he might have obtained information which would have enabled him to save the lives of his comrades, of British officers or of innocent people or whatever. Of course, if this had happened, the man would have cursed him with his dying breath when he discovered that he'd been deceived. It was an easy choice. If you're a utilitarian, You say, well, in order to increase human happiness, of course, you must tell a lie. But of course, there may be other things, such as human relations, such as not telling a man a lie as the very last thing which happens to him in his life. When one of Dostoevsky's heroes said, if I'm asked whether I'm prepared to purchase the happiness of millions of people at the price of the torture of one innocent child, I refuse. Was his answer obviously wrong? A utilitarian would be forced to say, yes, it was obviously wrong, sentimental and wrong. But of course, people don't think that. They think a man is perfectly entitled to say, I will not torture an innocent child. I will not inflict pain upon an innocent creature. I don't know what will happen next. There are certain things which no man may do, no matter what the cost. Well, here are two philosophies in conflict. One is utilitarian, and the other apparently is concerned with certain absolute values. There are two sets of values here which come into conflict. It isn't the job of the moral philosopher to tell a man which of these values to make his own, but it is his job to tell him that in a situation of this kind, these are the values that are involved. These are the forms of life which have come into collision. These are the issues which he has to decide between. And in the end, of course, a man has to accept personal responsibility and just do what he thinks right.
One thing that I think astonishes many laymen, and indeed puts many of them off, is the discovery that a tremendous amount of philosophical discussion, especially nowadays, is about words, is about language. Now, can you explain why that is so in a way that will justify it?
Well, I don't know. I'll do my best. I think modern philosophers, some of them, have done themselves a disservice by insisting that they're mainly concerned about language. People then think that there's something trivial in what they do, that they're concerned about language in a way in which lexicographers or grammarians are concerned, in which case lexicographers and grammarians are better at it than amateur persons of this kind. Yes, they are concerned with language because they believe that we think in words. And therefore, the examination of language is automatically the examination of thought, as it used to be called. And therefore, when these difficult philosophical questions face one to which there isn't any obvious answer, where we don't know the root, the first thing to do is to ask ourselves, what kind of question is this? What sort of answer are we looking for? Is it like this sort of question or like that sort of question? Is it empirical? Is it formal? Is it like neither? Is it more like this or more like that? The first thing is to sort it out. Sorting out is quite a difficult thing to do. And this sorting out is, in a sense, if you like, the clearing up of linguistic confusions. And these kind of confusions often lead to terrible muddle in people's heads, which sometimes lead to barbarism in practice. I don't know, it's like, certainly all kinds of beliefs, which I don't know, all kinds of totalitarian states, for example, implant in the heads of their...
Well, a lot of Nazi beliefs about race, for example, rested on muddles of all kinds.
Partly empirical, partly not. I mean, the very notion of a sub-man, the very notion that there was certain subhuman creatures, Jews, whoever it might be, or gypsies or Negroes, were subhuman, and therefore had to be exterminated. Well, the notion that if they were a danger to society, they ought to be exterminated, was no doubt founded on a false empirical belief. But the notion of subhumanity at all, what it means to be human, subhuman, this series of concepts, that is something which, if it sounds trivial, which the examination of language, how we use the word human, what human nature is, what it is to be a human being, what it is to be inferior and superior, these are philosophical questions, not empirical questions.
So indeed, some language philosophers could claim, and have claimed, that by analysing the use of language, they are, in fact, freeing us from the spell of language. It isn't, in other words, it's not they who are under the spell of language, but we. And an analysis of our misuses of language can liberate us from them.
Indeed. Indeed, I should say that's one of the major services. And I think that is why they are regarded as dangerous people, by those who want the original use of language to be kept. It was the German poet Heine who said, do not mistake the quiet philosopher in his study. He's a very powerful and formidable figure. Do not think him a mere harmless pedant engaged upon a lot of trivial tasks. If Kant had not beheaded the god of the theologians, Robespierre might not have beheaded the king. The great German metaphysicians, Fichtians, Schedlingians, and the like, are people who will one day not be deterred either by fear or by pursuit of pleasure, and will destroy a great many monuments of our civilization. When this great metaphysical rage explodes over the world, the French Revolution will seem to be a mere child's play, and so on and so on. The power of philosophical or metaphysical ideas is very great.
Well, I mean, there is something very peculiar about questions of the kind that philosophy raises, isn't there? I mean, if you ask, what is a right? You used that just now as an example. Is one inquiring into the meaning of a word? Or is one inquiring into the nature of some abstract entity which nevertheless exists even though it's abstract? I mean, what kind of a question is the question, what is a right?
Exactly. Well, what you're already doing, I think, is you are saying, when you say that you have a certain right, what is it like to say that? I mean, how do we discover whether this sort of thing is true or false? How do we discover what kind of arguments would lead you to accept a proposition that you have a certain right, say a right to happiness, or on the contrary not? I mean, when Luther, let us say, says, when somebody said to him that men are entitled to happiness, or the goal of life is happiness, he said, happiness? Certainly not. Leiden, Leiden, Kreuz, Kreuz, suffering, suffering, the cross, the cross. Well, this is at the heart of a certain form of Christian religion, and it's certainly one of the most profound motifs, if you like, one of the most profound beliefs, which a very large number of exceedingly unshallow human beings have built their lives upon. This is surely not trivial. We can say words, yes. We can say, what does the word cross mean? What does the word suffering mean? That isn't the point. We're not grammarians. We're not lexicographers. In order to find out what these words mean, it's no use looking up dictionaries. It's no use looking up encyclopedias. That is the point.
But it's still not entirely clear, if you're not trying to find out their meaning in that sense, what is it you're trying to get at? After all, some of the greatest geniuses in the history of the human race have thrashed out issues of this kind for 2,000 or 3,000 years without reaching any settled and generally accepted answers. This again points to the peculiarity of the questions, I think.
Well, let me put it this way. Let's ask ourselves how questions in general are settled. What sort of questions can be settled? Well, there are two great classes of these questions about which this can be said with a certain firmness, I think. One is ordinary empirical questions. That's the questions about what there is in the world. This is the sort of thing which the sciences deal with. I mean, are there black swans in Australia? Yes, there are, because someone has seen them there. What is matter made of? It's made of certain types of molecules. Molecules are made of atoms. There is a certain amount of evidence for this because experiments are conducted, and these experiments are sometimes crucial and lead to the confirmation of theories. Common sense is like that. Where is the cheese? The cheese in the cupboard. How do you know? I've looked. This is regarded as a full and perfectly sufficient answer to this question, and I wouldn't doubt that, nor would you. These are called empirical questions, questions of fact which are settled either by ordinary common sense or in more complicated cases by rather controlled observation, by experiment, by hypotheses, by the verification of hypotheses, and so on. That's one type of question. Then there is a question, for example, that are formal questions, questions which mathematicians ask, which logicians ask. There you have a certain number of definitions, you have a certain number of transformation rules about how to deduce things in these definitions, and you have conclusions which follow in a rigorously logical manner from these premises. And there you have certain sets of rules in accordance with which all answers, all propositions can be checked. This is not about the world at all. This is about formal disciplines which are, so to speak, entirely divorced from questions of fact. Mathematics, logic, chess, heraldry. You don't discover the answer by looking at the window, by looking at the cupboard. If I ask you, how do you know that the king in chess moves only one square at a time? It's no good someone saying, well, you say he only moves one square at a time, but you know, one evening I was looking at a chessboard and I actually saw a king move 2 squares. This would not be regarded as a refutation of this proposition, because what you're really saying is there is a rule in chess, according to which the king. And how do you know the rule is true? The rules don't have to be true, they just have to be rules. You either accept them or you don't. This is how mathematics works and all formal disciplines. These are great provinces of human knowledge. Between these, if I may so put it, there are certain questions which cannot be answered in this fashion. And there are a great many such questions. The thing about the two classes I've just tried to explain about is that there are formal methods of how to set about the answer. You may not be able to know the answer to an empirical question, but you know what kind of answer the answer would be if you knew it. If you say, how long did Caesar live for? You may not know how many years he lived for, but you know how to find out. You know what kind of authors to look up. You know what kind of evidence would be evidence for it. If you ask, are there flightless birds in Thailand? Well, there may or may not be. You may not know the answer, but you would know what kind of experiments to conduct for the purpose of discovering it. The same is true of astronomy. We don't know what the other side of the planet Sirius looks like. You would never seen it, perhaps. But you know that if you could fly there, as you can now fly to the moon, perhaps you would see it, and so on. This is true of formal disciplines equally. There are certain unsolved problems, but there are certain accepted methods for solving these. And you know that looking, smelling, touching won't do in mathematics. Calculation won't do in ordinary the empirical sphere, and so on. In the case of philosophy, the great hallmark, I would like to say, is that you don't know how to proceed. Someone says to you, what is the good? What are the ends of human life? Should we pursue pleasure, or should we pursue justice or truth? Even if it doesn't give you any pleasure. How do you set about answering this question? Someone says to you, what do you mean by real? How do you distinguish reality from appearance? Somebody says to you, what is knowledge? What do we know? Can we know anything for certain? Apart from mathematical knowledge, is there anything else we know for certain? How do we know that we know it for certain? What do you do? We don't immediately. There isn't a formal discipline which we say, well, now, there's an expert. He'll be able to tell you what is good. He'll be able to tell you what is right. He'll be able to tell you what is duty. He'll be able to tell you what are rights. He'll be able to tell you whether happiness is the right goal of human beings or isn't. You just listen to him. The mathematician, of course, can answer mathematical questions. We don't think that there are moralists who give absolutely clear answers which any human being who can follow their reasoning is bound to accept. So therefore, there is a certain puzzle at the very beginning about where to look. Nobody quite knows what to do with them. There's a sort of sense of mental cramp which sets in fairly early in the case of ordinary men who ask themselves these questions until they stop asking them.
You've come to something absolutely fundamental now, Sir Isaiah, and what I'd like to, if I may, is, as it were, recapitulate how we've got to the point we're at before we start making further forward moves. Yes. I take it that what you're saying is that throughout the history of mankind, men in their search for knowledge have asked most commonly two kinds of questions. In the first place, there are questions about the world. Man is simply finding out about and mastering his environment and coping with his environment. And questions about the world are answered by looking at it, by investigation, observation, testing, experiment, and so on.
Yes.
These are factual questions. The second kind of question are questions of a more abstract or formal kind, like questions in mathematics or in logic or, as you said, in games or in heraldry. And with questions of this kind, you can't find out the answer by observing the world, because questions of this kind concern the interrelationships between entities inside formal systems, the one we most commonly use obviously being that of arithmetic or more generally mathematics. So you have empirical questions about the world, which involve looking at the facts, and formal questions which involve relating one thing to another inside a formal system. And that nearly all knowledge, nearly all questions, fall into one of these two baskets, so to speak. Now, what you're saying is, I take it, that philosophical questions, the hallmark of a philosophical question is that it doesn't fall into either of these baskets. A question like what is a right is something that you can neither find the answer to by looking out of the window, nor find the answer to by looking at the internal coherence of a formal system. And therefore, you don't know how to go about finding the answer. And this possession of a question without any understanding of how to look for the answer is, as it were, the hallmark of a philosophical question. Is that...
You put it far better than I have, yes, much more clearly.
Well, you
accept
put it first.
Yes, but I accept this reformulation of it with pleasure.
Yes.
Pleasure.
Well, now, these are very fundamental questions, and we don't know how to go about answering them. What are we to do with questions that we don't know how to answer? I mean, what progress can we make with them, and how do we make progress?
Well, you have to ask historical questions. Why do we admire the thinkers who've treated them? We admire the thinkers who've treated them because they've managed to reformulate the questions, usually in such a manner as to make certain answers at least seem plausible. When there isn't a fixed method for doing a thing, you do what you can. That is to say, you simply worry the thing out. You say, well, now, when I ask a question like, do things have a purpose? What is it like? What kind of question is it? What sort of answer am I looking for? What would be the kind of argument which would lead me to think it's true or false? And this is what I think philosophy is about. Ian Forster once said, everything is like something. What is this like? This is exactly what you do in the case of philosophical questions. When there isn't any obvious method of doing it, you do what you can. And historically, what has happened is this, I think. Certain questions have been in this rather confused condition. Important, crucial, people have worried themselves deeply about them, and indeed rightly, because they affect their ultimate values to a large extent, and they didn't quite know how to set about them. Those who were dogmatic, who simply accepted the pronouncements of sacred books or of inspired teachers, of course, didn't worry. But there were always people a little bit skeptical about this and who asked themselves, why should we accept these answers? They say that, but do we know that they know? How do we know that they do know? They say God said so, but of course God seems to say very different things to different people. How do we know which is true? Historically, I think what has happened is that some of these questions have been so reformulated they fall into one of the other two baskets, historically speaking. For example, let me explain what I mean. Take astronomy. In the 12th century, it was perfectly right to say that astronomy was a philosophical subject. Why? Because it wasn't purely empirical, and it wasn't formal. Because people thought that planets went in circles because the circle was a perfect figure. Now, the proposition that the circle is a perfect figure is not an empirical proposition, and it isn't a formal proposition. Why one should believe it is another question. It certainly isn't neither of those. You can't prove it by experiment, and you can't prove it by mathematical proof. So this is obviously a metaphysical truth. So long as metaphysics entered, and people knew that stars had to do certain things, planets had to do certain other things, the sun had to do certain things, so long as they knew, and they knew on metaphysical or theological grounds, it was perfectly properly philosophical. Then, I needn't tell you how, everyone knows, astronomy gradually became an observational science. It shed its metaphysical presuppositions, and it is now a respectable part of what might be called the physical, i.e. empirical sciences. And in this way, it ceased to be philosophical. And one of the interesting things about the career of philosophy is that it constantly sheds certain parts of itself into one of these two baskets. I think it was my colleague Austin who once put this truth in the form of this hypothesis that the great sun gradually secretes out of itself the other planets. And as the other planets become independent, great masses of burning gas become planets, they acquire an independent life of their own. This has been, to a large extent, the history of philosophy. In this way, for example, I suppose economics is part of philosophy when it was mixed up with a lot of a priori beliefs, metaphysical assumptions, but then it gradually became an empirical science.
But there remains also, even when the sciences, or when the other fields of inquiry have hived off on their own, like economics or astronomy or psychology or linguistics or whatever it might be, there remains in a very important sense, doesn't there, a philosophy of almost any subject you care to name. What I have in mind is this, that in any field of activity there are certain fundamental terms, or I prefer, I think, to say fundamental concepts that people use. For example, physicists are constantly talking about light, mass, energy, velocity, gravity, motion, measurement, time. Or politicians are constantly using terms like freedom, equality, social justice, or lawyers are constantly using terms like guilt, innocence, justice again, though they mean something different by it. And usually the people practically involved in these fields of activity don't argue about the terms they're using. I should think most physicists go through the whole of their lives without arguing with another physicist about what light is or what they mean by the term energy. But the philosopher of science comes along and says, well, what exactly do we mean by light? What do we mean by measurement? What are we doing when we measure something? Or the political philosopher comes along and says, yes, but what exactly do we mean by freedom? What do we mean by equality? And there's even a philosophy of law, and the philosopher of law comes along and says, well, what exactly do we mean by justice? In other words, one of the activities of philosophy, surely, is to elucidate and analyze the concepts, the fundamental concepts that are used, characteristically used in each different area of human thought and human activity.
I think this is right.
Aren't these philosophical questions like what is time, what is light, what is good? They have something in common with children's questions, in fact, don't they?
Yes, I've often thought that. Children ask these questions of their elders. They say, they don't say what is time, they don't say that. But what they say is, why can't I meet Napoleon? Supposing a child said that, seems quite a natural thing for a child to do. And you say, you can't, he's dead. And then you say, well, why does this prevent one? And then if the father is sophisticated, he has to explain that death means his body becomes dissolved in the ground, he can't be resurrected, it happened a long time ago. And then if the child's at all sophisticated, a sophisticated child would say, well, can't all the bits be brought together again? And then the father says, no, they can't. What kind of can't? And then a lesson in physics follows. And the child says, no, I don't really want that. I don't want Napoleon now. I want to go back to see him as he was at the Battle of Austerlitz. That's what I'd like. Well, you can't, says the father. Why not? Because you can't move back in time. Why can't I? Then we have a philosophical problem. What is meant by can't? Is not being able to move back in time the same sort of can't as when you say twice 2 can't be 7? Or the same sort of can't as when you say you can't buy cigarettes at 2 o'clock in the morning because there's a law against it. Or I can't remember. Or I can't make myself 9 foot tall by merely wishing it. What sort of can't? What sort of must? And then we're plunged into philosophy straight away. And then you have to say, well, the nature of time. And then some people will say, no, there isn't such a thing as time. Time is just a word for before and after, and simultaneously with. To talk about time as if it was a kind of thing is a metaphysical trap. And we're launched. Well, most fathers don't want to answer children that way. They just tell them to shut up and not ask silly questions, go and climb a tree, as it were. But these are the questions which constantly recur, and philosophers are the people who are not terrified of them and are prepared to deal with them. Children, of course, ultimately are conditioned not asking these questions. More's the pity. The children who are not so conditioned turn into philosophers.
I think you need to say a little more about this, because I think one of the hardest things for the layman is to see what kind of illumination can be got out of trying to answer unanswerable questions.
Well, they're not unanswerable.
How can you make progress?
They're not unanswerable. They're not unanswerable. You can make some way towards an answer. They're not unanswerable. By clarifying the concept, sometimes you discover that the question has been falsely put. Sometimes you discover it's an empirical question, muddled up with a formal question. All kinds of things happen. But if you really want me to, let me give an example of something I'm trying to say. Take moral philosophy again, which is quite a good example because most people have moral problems in their lives. Now, what should we say? Supposing we ask a partly moral, partly political question. Supposing we say this. An ordinary question in a hospital. There is a kidney machine. It costs a very great deal. There are not very many of them. Many people have kidney disease for which this machine might be useful. Should we use these machines only for important people because they confer a lot of benefits in society? If there is a very important scientist who suffers from kidney disease, should the kidney machine be reserved for him in a fortnight's time, or there is some innocent child dying for which the kidney machine might save? How do we decide? What are we to do? Supposing there aren't enough machines to go around. What do we do? Should we put such questions to ourselves as which of these is going to benefit society most? This is an agonizing question of practice. Well, the moral philosopher is not going to give an answer to that and say, no, save the great scientist, save the child, doesn't matter which. What it will do, a good moral philosopher will explain to you what are the kind of considerations involved. He'll say, now what are you asking? Are you entirely concerned about the happiness of mankind? Is that your only consideration? If it is, then I just say it's right to save the scientist because he'll probably confer greater benefits than this child, however innocent. Or do you also believe that all men are equal and that all men have equal claim to be saved, and one mustn't even ask which of these people is more important? Is this your thought? Well, you see there is some conflict of values here. On the one hand, you believe in increasing human happiness. On the other hand, you believe that there is something wrong in obviously preferring some to others and creating a kind of hierarchy of claims.
When you said that the moral philosopher wouldn't tell you what to do in the case of your example of should we use the kidney machine for the scientist or the child, I think you said something extremely important for our present discussion. Because I think a lot of people come to philosophy wanting to be told how to live, or wanting to be given an explanation of the world or an explanation of life or something. And it seems to me that to have that desire is an abnegation of personal responsibility. One shouldn't want to be told how to live. One shouldn't want definitive answers. But it's an entirely different thing to want clarification of one's life, clarification of issues, and so on, so that one personally can take decisions and take responsibility for oneself.
It's a painful thing you're saying, but of course I agree with it. Most people want to be given answers. One of the things I remember very well, Turgenev, when he's writing about his own writing, says one of the troubles about his novels, why they're not more admired than they should be, is the Russian reader in the 19th century wants to be told how to live. And he wants to be quite clear about who are the heroes and who are the villains. And Turgenev, doesn't do this. Tolstoy did it, Dostoevsky did it, a lot of other writers do it, in Dickens there's no doubt who's who. who is good and who is not. But Turgenev says, all I do is paint human beings as they are. I don't guide the reader. I don't tell him on which side, so to speak, I myself stand. And this irritates them, annoys them, leaves them hanging in some sort of way, and people hate that. It's not the business of the moral philosopher any more than it's the business of the novelist to guide people in their lives. What his business is to face them with the alternatives, with the issues, explain to them what they're choosing among, and then, in the light of whatever it is they believe, they must plump.
There is, of course, one philosophy in the modern world which is perhaps the most widely influential and the most widely discussed in the world as a whole, and that is Marxism, which does tell people how to live and does give them a complete explanation of the world and of history and of life in general. Do you think that differentiates it from other kinds of philosophy?
It differentiates from other kinds of philosophy to this extent, that it isn't typically a philosophy at all. Marxism is a theory of history, and Marxism says we can explain the development of human society in a causal sort of way, by explaining how human beings developed as they have. There are certain laws, and when you grasp these laws, you will understand why things have happened as they have, why you are where you are on the social map, why you hold the ideas that you do, because perhaps you belong to a given class, and this particular class has the ideas it has because it is engaged in a struggle with certain other classes, and your ideas are in some way determined by your position in the class struggle. Now, this is an empirical theory of history. They may pretend that it's something else, but it is actually an attempt to produce a science of human development, a sociology, in fact, on a level with physics, chemistry, biology. I'm using different concepts, using different categories, of course, but it's a science. And once you understand how human society develops, you will then be able better to operate, to live better, just as if you understand physics, if you know physics, if you understand chemistry, if you understand biology, you are better able to go about the universe without being a victim of unknown forces, which perhaps breed superstition and terror. This is what Marxism claims, but that's not its philosophical aspect. That is simply Marxism as an empirical theory of historical development.
It does offer one a model of society and a model of history and a model of man's relationship to man. And indeed, that brings one to a question that I want to raise with you very much. I talked earlier about how one of the tasks of philosophy and philosophers is to elucidate concepts. But of course, that is only one of the tasks. I mean, concepts are, as it were, atoms of our thinking. But we don't only think with the atoms, we also think in what are usually called models. That is to say, for example, if we're talking about society, some thinkers have seen society as a sort of machine put together by man to accomplish certain tasks in which the various moving parts connect up with the various moving parts in certain ways. Other people have tended to look on society as a sort of organism, as something that grows like a living thing in the way that the oak comes out of the acorn. Now, depending on which metaphor or which picture or which model, as people usually say, of society you use, you will usually derive all sorts of other practical consequences from it and tend to behave in different ways, have different attitudes to government, to history, and so on. Now, another of the tasks of the philosopher is it not, the critical examination of models?
Yes, this is absolutely true. Marxism is a perfect good example of what you mean. You see, Marxism uses as a model something rather like an evolutionary theory. It applies it to the whole of human society, but Marx himself is perfectly conscious, indeed proud of the fact that he supposed himself to have discovered the, if not the solution, at any rate the road to the solution of what might be called the social development on the analogy of Darwinism in the realm of biological nature. Whether he did or not is another question. That's what Engels claimed for him. And that means that he used this particular model. Now, I think I'm not mistaken in supposing, I've always thought, that the history of philosophy is largely the history of changing models. And the examination of these models is, in a way, a very typical philosophical task. Again, Mr. Forster, everything is like something, what is this like? The only way in which you can explain things to people, usually, is by some kind of analogy, from the known to the unknown. You are faced with something puzzling. What is man? What is human nature? And you say, well, human nature is rather like Take zoology, now we know a great deal more about that. Take botany, we know a good deal about that. Human nature isn't awfully unlike that. There is a general science of all creatures in nature. That's what the 18th century thought. Why should we suppose that human beings are different? What we can do, said Condorcet, for bees and beavers, we ought to do for men. Zoologists are able to produce a science of bees and beavers, and in time we shall have a science of men on the same sound, naturalistic principles. Plato, who is the beginning of all these things, who I suppose it was Whitehead who once said that philosophy was simply a lot of footnotes to Plato. Plato really started all the great questions which have troubled us ever since. Plato thought that the mathematical model was the model, that you could somehow explain the universe in some sort of geometrical terms by deducing what there is from some kind of indestructible ultimate truth to which he tried to show the path. When you saw the idea of the good, you would understand how everything is necessarily what it is. Everything follows from some huge quasi-mathematical model in which everything fits absolutely precisely as it does in geometry. Aristotle used biological models. Other people used other models. In the 17th century, for example, people tried to explain what society was like in terms of legal models. That's what the social contract is about. And always when a new model comes, it throws light on something. People say, ah, yes, the old model, the old hierarchical model of the Middle Ages in which the thing was like a pyramid or perhaps like an orchestra in which every group of instruments had its own specific function which God assigned to it, that doesn't really explain things. We don't think that there is something really sacred about kings and sacred about great captains, which isn't true about ordinary peasants. This just isn't so. This is much better. Contract. This is the real thing. So that the new model liberates one from the oppression of the old one. And then this model obscures the truths which the old model showed, and is in turn replaced by another model, which of course liberates you from the second model, but obscures bits of that, and then the fourth model comes, and the fifth model comes, and so we go from model to model. And why do we choose certain models? Because there are certain problems which oppress us particularly at particular moments of history because of what happens around us, because of the pressures upon us.
It seems to me extraordinary that so many so-called plain men should assert that the critical examination of these models is really an abstract and unrealistic activity, because if you don't drag out into the light the presuppositions of your thinking, especially in moral and political and social spheres, then that makes you simply the prisoner of whatever the reigning orthodoxy is. It makes you the prisoner of the existing model, of the model of your age or the model of your day. And of course, these philosophical ideas that we're discussing have had such immense practical influence. I mean, on the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, on the religions of the world, on the Marxist governments of the world. I mean, these are all examples of how philosophical ideas, in the most direct and obvious way, have practically influenced human beings. So the view that this is sort of unconnected with real life seems to me to be itself unconnected with real life, profoundly unrealistic.
But I entirely agree. I think if ordinary men think so, it's because perhaps some philosophers have used unnecessarily esoteric language for dealing with these things. But of course, one mustn't blame them either. Once one becomes absorbed in a subject, one must be absorbed in its detail too. And although the great philosophers have always spoken in a manner which somehow managed to penetrate to ordinary men, so that they have understood it in some simplified version at least, the minor philosophers tend, I think, perhaps to become occupied with the minutiae of the subject. But that's all it comes to. I think it was Russell who once said something which seemed to me profoundly wise, rather unexpected from him, oddly enough, I think, which is this, that the great, the central philosophies of the great philosophers of the world are essentially simple. That the elaboration is not in the model of the world, not in the pattern in terms of which they saw the world, but in defenses of this pattern against real or imaginary objections. There, of course, a lot of ingenuity comes in, there a lot of technical language comes in, and all this is very necessary. But the fundamental vision is intelligible, is comparatively simple. You already do know the fundamental vision of Descartes, the fundamental vision of Locke, the fundamental vision of Plato, the fundamental vision of Kant, the fundamental vision of some contemporary philosophers too, is intelligible to ordinary men. It isn't esoteric.
Well, I hope we shall succeed in the rest of this series in making some of these visions, as you call them, intelligible to ordinary men. Thank you very much, Sir Isaiah.